Okay, here we're going to be talking about Chapter 7, Democracy, and talking a little bit about autocracy as well. And as you may notice, as with other chapters, I'm talking about some things about democracy that aren't specifically in the textbook. So that's why it's very important to watch the lectures. We've already discussed democracy a little bit as far as what it means, rule by the people. And we've looked at that spectrum from democracy to autocracy. When we go looking back at the ancient Greek philosophy, Aristotle wrote that it ruled by many better than ruled by one. And what we have today is more of a constitutional republic. There's always been problems with pure democracy, as we've talked about before, where it could potentially lead to mob rule or the tyranny of a majority. But with any type of democratic system, it's anchored in these democratic principles that we're going to be talking about with the institutions that help shape behavior, and it's constantly evolving. And Winston Churchill, of course, talking about democracy, worst form of government, except for all of the others that have been tried. So that's why it's very complex. Now, we'll be talking more about democratic political culture in the next chapter. But we do know in a political democratic culture, we have a respect for the rule of law. That takes a long time to establish, and it has to be written form of laws such as our Constitution, and then the respect for that written law has to maintain itself over many generations, and that's where we develop part of our political culture is this respect for the rule of law. Also, democracies hold elections. Now, there are many cases where countries that aren't very free, they hold elections and claim to be democratic systems, but still have a long way to go. But clearly, holding elections is one of the fundamental elements of a democratic culture. Now, this concept right here is interesting as to what we call a democratic bargain. But what we have in a democratic or political culture is this tolerance between the subcultural elements. We have evolved together under this rule of law, under a representative system, and what could be called a democratic bargain has developed over time to where each group of these subcultural elements, whether it's interest groups, identity groups, ethnic groups, each of these groups accepts that it must abide by the end result and is able to get enough of it at once. It may actually be able to get more later. But this is very important, that is very much kind of taken for granted in a political culture because we see in lots of countries out in the world, groups cannot get along. In fact, they can't even coexist, much less accept some end result in order to get some amount of this piece of the pie. Another element of a democratic culture is that elected officials have control over the military and the police force. We'll talk a little bit more about what are some of the problematic elements of military governments, military dictatorships, but that has been a long-standing democratic principle that you have civilian control over the military. Another thing that is very difficult to define is this interdependence between state and civil society, or some form of balance between support for the government with a healthy skepticism of government just to keep them held accountable, make sure that they don't get too powerful or corrupt. Another aspect of a democratic culture that is somewhat arguable because there are some countries that are developing market economies but are not necessarily going democratic. But generally, the political culture has kind of come hand in hand with a market economy in that once you develop choices for your jobs, choices for the products that you choose, and choices for what careers that you want to do in your life, well, along with those choices comes political choices as to who I want to govern my country. And then the concept of education cannot be overstressed in a democratic culture because we allow for education, not propaganda-filled information that maintains support for the government. So not just learning your 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but something that is very fundamental to a democratic culture that is no guarantee that it will stay there, but just interest in knowledge for its own sake. It keeps a society smarter, I suppose you could say, in order to make better decisions for the good of your society. The democratic movements throughout global history have come in waves. First wave was considered to have come after World War I. That was the world to make the world safe, or to make the world safe for democracy. After World War II, we had another wave of democratization. And then in the 1970s, we started what is called the third wave. This has been studied quite a bit in political science. And for almost a 20-year period, we had a fairly substantial wave of countries moving towards democratic systems. Several in Latin America in the 80s, plus with the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, we had several countries there that were willing to move democratic. And so we see from this period there in this third wave, the world grew from 31% of all the countries in the world being democratic to 62%. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. We'll talk about that here in a second. We do know that the third wave was driven by several things. There were several authoritarian regimes that started to get fatigued. There was a lot of international pressure at that time, particularly during the Cold War, to pressure countries to go more democratic. There's a little bit more of awareness of human rights and security issues. And then, of course, in many countries that failed economically, or that there was a crisis in some transition of leadership, that was an opportunity for, since people know more and more about democracy, then here's an opportunity for states to pursue democracy. Now, after the third wave, this is interesting. There's been no net growth of democracies since the late 1990s. This is a very fascinating question as to why has there been a stagnation of more democracies. There's been decline over the past several years. We'll look at the Freedom House report here in a minute, but there has been a decline in freedom rankings for the past several years. The recent Arab Spring uprisings that occurred in 2011 were inspired by a desire for democracy, but there was considerable instability in this transition, and of those Arab Spring uprisings, only one of them has resulted in what some might call a success. That would be Tunisia. They won the Nobel Peace Prize. But when you look at Libya, Egypt, and even particularly Syria, those have been very mixed results. And of course, in Syria, just constant turmoil where what may have started off as a desire for democracy fell very quick into a religious divided civil war. Now, this is from a previous Freedom House report. We'll talk about what Freedom House does in a minute, but what we have here is a chart from 72 up to 2012 of all the countries in the world that are considered free countries, partly free, or not free. And so what we can see here is that, as shown in the third wave, first of all, let's look at this column right here, these two columns here of free countries. So as you can see, we are steadily improving as far as the percent of the countries in the world that are free, steadily increasing, as you can see right here. As we get into the 90s, 40%, 42%, and as you can see, it peaks right here in 1998. 40% of the world's countries are considered free. As you can see, it stagnated from that point, and even at 2012, it was still at 46%. But what we see is that it started to detract a little bit from that. The next slide here shows, this is straight from Freedom House's 2016 report, and their evaluation of the year 2015, we're now at 44% of the world's countries are now free. So that's a decline. That's a very fascinating thing in political science as to why, if democracy seems to be a desired outcome, how come there's been kind of a pushback on it? Now, here's what Freedom House does. Freedom House is one of several nonprofit organizations out there that try to measure the government's stability or their levels of freedom or their corruption, things like that. Freedom House is one of the most well-known and highly respected organizations. They rank countries on the order from 1 to 7. A country is considered free if it's ranked from 1 to 3, and there, as you can see, the criteria that they look for: open political competition, respect for civil liberties, civic life, independent media. Now, partly free, this does include many democracies, but look at the negatives: limited respect for political rights and civil liberties, frequent corruption, weak rule of law, ethnic and religious strife, single-party dominance. So even though a country may be ranked partly free from 3 to 5, you see still a lot of things still left to occur to get to a free ranking. Now, the countries that are ranked not free from 5 to 7, basic political rights are not there, basic civil liberties are systematically denied. So let's look at some of those. Here's a map that was taken right out of the recent report from Freedom House. So the green countries are the ones that are ranked free in the world, and then you can see some correlations here, because the most successful, prosperous democracies, capitalist democracies, I guess you could say, are also kind of correlated with the free countries. No big surprise there. We start seeing these same patterns. Partly free, we've got some in South America, and we've got several in Africa.
Europe.
And then as far as the countries ranked not free, quite a few in Africa, many in Asia. Freedom House also, in their latest report, puts out the worst of the worst countries. There's 50 countries in the world that are designated as not free, and these 12 here have the worst aggregate scores: Syria, Tibet, Somalia, North Korea, Uzbekistan, all the way to Saudi Arabia, which is an ally of the United States, but has consistently been considered one of the least free countries in the world. So this is where it gets complicated. Now let's talk about the sustainability of democracy. Democracy is more difficult to sustain than an autocracy for several reasons. For one, the leaders are held accountable to try to spread power and spread benefits, and they could get defeated in the next election. There could be lots of groups that are jockeying for position to try to get benefits in a democratic society. Particularly if you're a poor country that's trying to make that transition, it is very difficult to maintain that. An autocratic leader does not have to be held accountable. If the economy is terrible, it doesn't really matter to him. He's still in power and he can still hoard a lot of wealth. But the openness that is brought about with this transition to a democracy does unleash a lot of these regional and nationalist pressures, which makes democracy difficult to maintain. Now, we have seen that democracy is more likely when it's preceded over a period of time by a slow liberalization process, where that means freedoms are kind of incrementally allowed as a somewhat of a long-term strategy, and this may actually be in conjunction with opening up to a market economy as well. As you open up to a market economy, you start allowing more elections, a little bit more political competition, as well as economic competition. We've seen some examples there where South Korea and some of the Asian tigers we talked a little bit about before have been very successful in their transition. China, however, is going to be an interesting case study because they have been incrementally changing over to a market economy and shown dramatic progress and improvements, taking over 1 billion people out of poverty. But they have also maintained their authoritarian political system, so it'll be interesting to see what kind of tensions that might create. Now, we also know that in order to sustain your democracy, there's been lots of studies on this, is if your economy doesn't improve in a reasonable amount of time, the system and the people become dissatisfied with this new system. If their economy is not any better, my lot in life is not any better off than it was before, so what's the big deal about this democracy? Give me back a leader that tells me what to do and takes care of us, as we might even be seeing in Russia. Lots of studies on this. If the economy does not improve, you could backslide back to an authoritarian system. We do know that because capitalism and democracy do tend to kind of come together as a package deal, no guarantee of that, but we do see because of those equal systems of choice and freedoms that they have kind of come together. And as we see very clearly that the average gross domestic product, this is GDP per capita, is considerably higher than the average GDP per capita of a non-democracy. So you can significantly see the difference there between democracies in general. Democracies are better at fostering growth, as I've said before, where democracies have to be held accountable. And in order to get reelected, they may have to spread some power and spread some benefits to other people, whereas a dictator does not have to do that, is not held accountable to do that if he doesn't want to. Now, interestingly enough, the reasons for becoming a democracy, despite this connection here, they have little to do with economic prosperity. There's even very well-advantaged people in these societies that would like to see a democracy. They may have to sacrifice a little bit, but there will be general benefits overall to society. So it's not necessarily that these Arab Spring uprisings were initiated because people wanted a market system or better economies. Their initial impetus was for freedom. Now, what we do see, however, is that once becoming a democracy, a state is more likely to remain if they are prosperous. So that goes right back to what I said in the previous slide, is that if your economy does not improve, then the democracy may fall by the wayside, and that brings up all kinds of other implications. Democracy has been somewhat equated with U.S. capitalism. Good, bad, right, or wrong has nothing to do with it. That's just how they've evolved. But as I said before, we're seeing some examples of some non-democratic market economies, such as China, that have been fairly successful taking advantage of this global capitalist system, but remaining authoritarian. And as far as we know, their strategy is to continue to have a successful economy so that the people will not be compelled to rebel or to clamor for a democratic system. They will hopefully say, according to the leaders, as far as what we know, we can't read their minds, but the leaders would not want to give up their power or this authoritarian system because they feel like they're making the right decisions. And if they keep making decisions that are good for the economy, then that's probably how it will stay for a while. Now, there are claims, particularly in some of the regions where anti-capitalist terrorism tends to foster, that Western ideals are being exported to the world. We talked about that a little bit with globalization. Western capitalism, Western democracy being not just exported to the world, but perhaps kind of forced upon people. Well, yes, there is some truth to that, but we also see that given the choice, that one of the reasons why democracies, or at least up until recently, why democracies and market systems had been relatively attractive is because Western societies have been good at providing things that human beings want. And that's very attractive to any system that wants to improve their society. So let's take just a few minutes and look at some authoritarian systems. Military governments are typically subject to coups, and that's just another word for an overthrow by perhaps another group or a faction that is not happy with the military dictatorship, or a faction of the military that wants to split away and could potentially try to overthrow or assassinate the general in charge. So constantly having to look over your shoulder, and that it's never totally stable. So therefore it remains fragile. And one of the things that contributes to that is that military leaders are not necessarily trained to be political leaders. There's no guarantee that a general couldn't become a great civilian leader, but if you're a military leader, your focus is on power and strength, not necessarily political compromise and benefits and things like that. With authoritarian military systems, there's a problem with who's going to succeed. And if there's a coup, well, that solves that problem. But short of a coup, who's going to take over from the military dictator or the general that's in charge? And then what you could have is some shaky alliance in order to maintain some sort of succession there. With single party authoritarian systems, we talked about that as far as our spectrum of political systems go, where yes, there may be elections, there may be some semblance of a democratic system, but typically a single party continues to maintain power. What they do is provide an institutional basis by writing the rules or rewriting the laws in order to make sure that that party stays in control, stays in the power, that there's no form of transition. The party typically picks the successor, and the system is permeated all the way down to the grassroots level, where local mayors are part of the system. They are obligated to make sure that the party stays in control, and this is where we get into the patronage type systems or the clientelist type systems, is where in order to maintain this single party system is that favors and bribes are kind of the order of the day. In order to get anything done, you owe it to the party, and if you're loyal to the party, you'll be rewarded with favors. If you bribe the party, you'll be rewarded with jobs, things like that. So the party puts themselves in a position so that they can embrace a fairly large range of social groups through this patronage system. And so therefore that helps them maintain control. Again, not necessarily looking at good, bad, right, or wrong. This is the system that has evolved here, and it maintains itself for very rational reasons, in that people in power want to stay in power, and people that want benefits, they know how to get benefits. So therefore, it has a tendency to sustain itself. But then, of course, if there's a single party in control with no political competition, it could also become very powerful, very corrupt, and only beholden to those that are willing to support it. Lots of potential problems there. With monarchies, these are systems, as we said before, where the rule is inherited through a royal family. In Saudi Arabia, a very prominent example there. We've also talked about theocracies where it's ruled by religious leaders. And more importantly, a rule by a religious doctrine is typically the constitution or the framework of its legal system is buttressed or literally a function of that religious doctrine. So what we see here is some potential controversies in that in Islamic regions, to where there are movements to push for a theocracy so that the entire society would be ruled by this religious faith, which could provide lots of unity for that group of people. But what we've seen, it's also caused a lot of conflict. Now, we do know that Iran is a good example of this theocracy, to where the imams rule under Islamic law, and there could be over time some conflict with a growing civil society that may show some resistance to that. And even though there is a president that's elected, he is still under the control of the religious leaders.